Well, welcome everyone. My name's Keith Golding. I'm Deputy Chair of the Ecological Continuity Trust, and it's my pleasure to chair and introduce the speaker today. Dr. Julie Ewald is Principal Scientist in Geographical Information Science at the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. Julie grew up on a mixed farm in northeast Nebraska, USA, and received her bachelor's degree and a master's in parasitology from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. She then moved to Glasgow University in Scotland as a Fulbright scholar and completed her doctorate in parasitology there. After working on malaria and mosquitoes in Thailand, Julie joined the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust in 1995. Her research utilizes the GWCT's long-term and GIS-enabled databases, including what's our focus today, the Sussex Study. The study is now in its 56th year and is described as the longest-running monitoring project in the world that measures the impact of changes in farming on the fauna and flora of arable land. It featured in a National Geographic article in 2018 in its 50th year, and we now have the opportunity to hear an up-to-date description from Julie. So Julie, thank you very much for agreeing to give this presentation today. So Julie, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, for the introduction, and thank you to ECT for asking me to come along. And thank you to everybody who's listening for taking some time out of a busy day, I'm sure, to listen to me. Keith, are you seeing my full slides?
Yes, that's fine. Everything's coming up.
Okay. So a slight change to the title. I'm not sure I'm actually going to show you any slides that cover the full 56 years of data. But I will go through quite a few things, but some of them up to 50 years, perhaps a little over. There's myself involved in the Sussex Study, Steve Morby, who's our head senior entomologist, and he's done since 1983 all of the identification of the insects. Nicholas Abisher, who some of you might know, who's our biometrician and keeps us on that straight and narrow path that we need to be on. Cameron Hubbard is a GIS analyst that's taking on some of the GIS aspects of this as I end up doing more administration. And then, of course, most importantly, Dick Potts, who many of you might know and who sadly passed away in 2017. It was Dick who started the Sussex Study and kept it going and was such a joy to do field work with for all those years. And we really do still miss him quite a bit. All right, so the Sussex Study, we think it's the longest data set in the world on the impact of farming and flora on particularly cereal ecosystems. And it takes place, as the name would suggest, in Sussex. It covers a core of 32 square kilometers, though I will admit that we've expanded some of that recently to almost 64 square kilometers in some cases of what we actually collect. It began in 1968, and it's really all to do about gray partridges, looking at their life history and at the changes in arable and cereal ecosystems that affect that life history. So along the way, we collect information about arable flora, the invertebrates in cereals, we call those cereal invertebrates, the crop rotation and changes in the landscape on those areas, and also pesticide use. So I think I'm going to cover almost all of those at some point in my talk today. So gray partridges. The thing that you need to think about, particularly as it relates to the Sussex Study, is that gray partridge chicks require insects in their diet in the first few weeks of their life. And this is an old set of photographs taken back in the late 60s to do with how the chicks develop feathers and grow and thrive. And so the one on the side, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but the one on the left side is the one that's had insects, and the other one, of course, is a diet without insects. If they do not get sufficient insects, they will not develop and they will not thrive. So we can look at this from the point of view of how important chick survival, this is the chicks surviving until they're 6 weeks, that's how we estimate this, is on population change. And this is data from the Sussex Study and other areas that shows that that change is driven by the survival in the year. So that was the thing that really drove what we wanted to look at in the Sussex Study. We go and sample insects in the 3rd week in June, and we do this using a DVAC. This is Steve with his DVAC. And we sample at least 100 sites every year. That's our goal. And we do all cereal fields across this area that is the core of the study area. So those are those magenta places that we go and sample in the cereal. And it's this edge of the cereal. And at the same time, we sample the arable flora in those edges of the cereal fields. And we have consistently used DVACs to do that sampling. So the insects that we're interested in, we refer to those as chick food, are these 5 main groups for partridges, and they form part of what's called the Gray Partridge Chick Food Index, which has been developed on the Sussex Study back by Dick Potts, and that was published in the late 1980s. And those are the carabids and the latarids, Symphyta and Lepidoptera, those are the caterpillars, chrysomelids and curculionids, the non-aphid hemiptera, the plant bugs, and then aphids. And additionally, we also usually report results on changes in the spiders and opleones, just because those are particularly important in something like corn bunting indices, which is another chick food indices that was developed by people working on research on corn buntings on the Sussex Study. So this is the kind of image you would get if you did a sweep sample, which often collects a lot of caterpillars. This is a really nice sample. If we had more of these, we'd have more partridges. And what we can show is that the chick survival rate is related to the chick food abundance in cereals. And so this is data published by Nicholas back in '97, which looked at the relationship between that abundance in cereals. Every point is a year from the Sussex Study and the survival rates. So this just emphasizes the importance of those insects on development and survival. So this is the concept of how that works in the life history of gray partridges and other farmland bird chicks. So arable flora provide the food for the insects that the chicks eat. And what has happened with the intensification of agriculture is a breaking of that chain. So herbicides have come in and taken out that arable flora, which has taken out the insects that feed on them. And then laterally, in subsequent years, the use of insecticide has become more widespread, and that has killed those insects directly. And we can show a lot of these results from some of the information that we've collected from the farmers on the Sussex Study. So this is some information on the intensity of pesticide use on Sussex. This is data I collected from the farmers. This is called spray area, expressed as a percent of the area treated by number of spray rounds. So it takes into account the area of the fields, but also the number of times there's a different application made. And sometimes, of course, it's only made to part of a field, and that takes into account that difference. So herbicide use was quite widespread at the beginning of the study. This is the 1970s, but both fungicide and insecticide use became more commonly used as we went through time. So herbicide use has increased in intensity, has had fungicide use, and that increase continues to the current day. Whereas insecticide use really plateaued from about the late 1980s to the 2005, and then has declined slightly. Now, we have compared this data to the data that the government provides on a 2-yearly basis and adjusted figures based on the cropping to see if the farmers on the Sussex Study are more intense or less intense in their use of pesticides based on the cropping. Because, of course, it depends what you use, as far as pesticides and the crop that you have. And actually, our farmers on Sussex are slightly less intense in their use of herbicide and fungicides. So what we show you is, for the effects of those things is probably less of an effect than might be happening nationally. But the insecticide use follows through and is very similar to what's happening across the country. So there is a general decline in insecticide use, which from what was the case in the 90s to the early 2000s. That's worth bearing in mind. And I also would underline that the farmers are not doing anything illegal or, this is the way that farming is managed in the current state of farming. So I'm not going to go really into a lot of the results from the arable flora. The last time we published specifically on this, Dick was the lead author of a paper in 2010. And I think if you're interested in a lot of the effects on the arable flora itself, it would be worth it to go and pick up that paper and have a look. But the interesting thing we did then that I think was, we already had a large, we knew that everybody used herbicides. But the thing that we did was we looked at the specificity of the cocktail of herbicides that went onto those farms. And we could show that the number of taxa, arable flora taxa, that were susceptible to that cocktail was increasing through time. And that we related this particularly for annual dicots and the annual dicot occurrence. So this is an example of forget-me-not. But in that paper, there's a lot more consideration of how these things are affecting the arable flora in the normal farming in Sussex. So what we've done with the pesticide application and the invertebrate numbers, and this is, I'm going to show you 3 slides that came out of work that was published in 2016. We looked at, on a field-by-field basis, the change in abundance when things were used, and we controlled for various factors. So we controlled for crop in the field that year. We controlled for the other pesticide types being applied. So that would be, we controlled for, if we're looking at the insecticide results, we already included in that model the herbicide use and the fungicide use. So we're just looking at the one thing we're interested in. And we also included a year, categorical year effect, to take out that variation that happens with insects on a year-to-year basis. And the general take-home from this slide is, unsurprisingly, insecticides kill insects. So, but it's worthwhile saying that we can show this, and we can show it on a broad scale across the Sussex study. And in some cases, there are also effects that we see with fungicide use, and for leaf beetles and weevils, also for herbicide use. So in addition to just use, we also looked at the type of insecticides used. And I know many people feel, particularly farmers, that pyrethroids are used at a very low rate. But our results, and I'm sure results from lots of other places, show that pyrethroids are, in spite of their small amount used, quite deadly to insects as well, particularly the sawflies, the leaf beetles and weevils, and the non-plant bugs. And the aphids are all killed by pyrethroids. So this is something that needs to be borne in mind. It's not just the small amount of chemical used, which is what is often used to measure pesticide use, is weight. It is also what it is capable of controlling. And then finally, and this is the last one of those slides I'm going to show you, we did analysis because we had a long-term data set with a field-by-field use, and we knew changes through time, both in the rotations and in the use. We looked at what is called maybe a carryover effect, although we don't think that this is actively killing anything at the time we're measuring it. What is happening is there's a general decline through time. And we were able to show that for 5 of the 6 groups we looked at, there is a significant effect of insecticide use previously used on the following year. So each of these is below the line with the stars, shows that there is a significant negative effect year on year. So this is all published, well, it's not published in the scientific literature, it's published in a report, and it needs to get out into the scientific literature when I next get time to sit down and write some papers. So just to let you know that the long-term trends for all of those chick food insect groups are all of declines, and there's a significant decline for 5 of those 6 groups across the study area. This is data from the bit of the Sussex study that all is this the normal type of farming. I'm not talking about anybody that's doing any fancy conservation efforts. This is what's happening on the Sussex study on what would probably represent farming across the country. And all of those, except for one, the chrysomelids and curculionids is a significant decline. So we have just published a paper on the changes in the invertebrate numbers across those. We did the 50-year time period from 1970 to 2019. And that's just come out in Insect Conservation and Diversity. And if anybody needs a link or anything, please let me know, but it is open access. So we've done annual indices of abundance, where we compare the first year of results to the final year. So the first year is taken as 1, and then we compare change since then. In our models, we've included the field, the location, and the year as factors. And we've restricted this to the part of the Sussex study that is considered normal agriculture. And later in the talk, I will talk about the non-normal part of the Sussex study, but I think we made the decision for this paper to do it with the part of the Sussex study that reflects what's going on in agriculture across the UK. And in those groups, we separated it into 51 reference taxa, as we call them, and those are usually to family and order. Most of what we identify in Sussex is not identified to the species level. We just do not have the time or resources to do it, but we do identify many to family, and those that we don't to family come to order. So we wanted to have a group of taxa that we could look at what's going on as a community in those cereal fields. And of those 51 taxa, nearly half, 47%, has statistically declined, significantly declined. 16% actually increased, and roughly 40% or 37% had no detectable change in abundance. So it's a little bit of a mixed picture. And if you look at the trends through time, and that paper has all the information that you would want to know about these individual taxa. So we wanted to compare that to various aspects of what else has changed on the Sussex study area. So one of the things, of course, that we can look at is the changes in the farming structure. And we can look at the different crops. So in the early 70s, definitely there was much more spring barley, and then we transitioned to a time of more winter wheat and some winter barleys. We went definitely from what was a patchwork sort of system to a more blocked system, and we've also witnessed an increase in field size, at least through the middle of the study of the 50 years. During the middle time of those 50 years, we had one farm that was wall-to-wall winter wheat for several years, over a decade. We also saw set-aside come in, and that's shown in the maroon on some of these maps. And we also had the environmental sensitive area come in and cover the Sussex study area. And that meant that some farmers planted almost every field to grass and left it to grass for a long time. Finally, in the last 20 years, we've moved to more agri-environment being picked up, to smaller fields, so a return, farmers have cut down fields, and a return to a more patchwork system. So I'm not going to say that there isn't block cropping still going on, but it's happening on a smaller scale. And also the farms that are doing this are dividing some of their fields using agri-environment options, so beetle banks and other things. But I've got the yellow circle on the 2020 map to remind me to tell you that part of the Sussex Study area has gone into a major conservation project to try to recover numbers of gray partridges. And so in the analysis of the invertebrate work that we did not include data from there because this area has conservation headlands on every cereal field. And we feel this is not comparable to farming across the UK. But I will go into that in a minute. So the long-term changes in farming can be visualized like this, where we've got the red winter wheat has come in, the light blue spring barleys, and the rotational grass coming through from the environmental sensitive area. So you can see that has really taken over a lot of this. And the increase followed by a decrease in average field size. So over 50 years, you see the changes. And the other thing that we have compared to our insect invertebrate numbers were long-term changes in temperature and rainfall. So overall, for the last 50 years, there's been roughly a 1 degree C increase from in spring temperatures. This is late spring, early summer temperatures. And at the same time, there's been a lot of variation in rainfall at the same time, but there's no overall pattern, at least at that time in the year. So we did some Kanoko analysis looking at the community changes through time for these invertebrate taxa. And this is part of that paper that's just been published. And we find that the landscape, which we measured as cropping composition and field size, explained about 19% of variation. Management, which was the pesticide use, explained about 16% of variation in that community, and weather about 15%. So all of those things are significant, but they also overlap each other, and particularly the landscape and the management. So, I mean, from a point of view of, as you would expect, cropping and pesticide use are related, and they explain a lot of the variation of what we're seeing, those two working together. So that's a review of that paper that's just come out and kind of gives a flavor of some of the changes we've seen on invertebrate areas. And it is definitely a little bit depressing. So I'm going to show you something that's less depressing, which is where one farmer made the decision that they were going to change things. So this is the Sussex Study area. This is our counts where we count is in white. And on here, all of the red dots are coveys of gray partridges counted in the autumn. So the size of the covey reflects the number of young. And this is the counts from 2003 autumn. And you'll notice the area over to the west is highlighted both in orange, and I've got a big old purple circle around it, oval around it. And we counted on that area 13 gray partridges in the total of that area. And one of them was a lone male. And if you know something about gray partridge behavior, they do not like to be on their own. If you've got single males running around the place in the autumn, you know that you've got a real problem with partridge density. And we thought we were probably witnessing an extinction on that side of the study area in the next few years. So what happened was Dick Potts drives off to see the farmer, and he tells him that if you don't do something soon, you're not going to have any gray partridges left on your land. So the farmer decided to do something. And this is the result. So this is the best year that we've counted since 2003. This is 2011. And on that year, where we counted 13 in 2003, we counted nearly 2,000 gray partridges. And gamekeepers, because there are gamekeepers on that area, counted 2,500 because they are much more efficient than we are. But so definitely a recovery. And the reason the farmer did it was, one, he did want to recover gray partridges just because he had very much a memories from his childhood about seeing them. And the other was, of course, to reinstate a wild gray partridge shoot. So to move from a released pheasant shooting system to a wild gray partridge shooting system. So how did he do it? So these are the results to show you from 2011, which was that good year, but effectively this has happened every year since. They divided up the fields. So we've got 2003 pre-management. You can see the fields are fairly large and the cropping composition was blocked at that time. I'm not showing it you here, but it was effectively big blocks of winter wheat followed by lots of blocks of break crops, not too much spring barley. And that's changed. The other thing that's happened is every field has been divided at least once, and most of those field boundaries reflect what was the case back in the early 1970s before the UK joined the Common Agricultural Policy, and we scoured all of our, or many of our hedges. And around every one of the cereal fields, there is a conservation headland, and also wild bird cover strips directed at providing both resources over winter, but also some resources in the summer. So those are around they're around every field as well. So this is what it looks like. This is one of those conservation headlands. They've put in new beetle banks to the side here to the right, and those have hedges on them. Most of the beetle banks have been they've actually installed hedges on them. For you who don't know what a conservation headland is, and maybe I'm teaching my grandfather to suck eggs, but the idea is that you turn off the pesticide applications on the outer boom of your pesticide, your tractor and applicator going through the field. And in most cases, in these conservation headlands on this area in Sussex, they're also low nitrogen. So, and low seed rate. So you get a real plethora of arable flora coming into the bottom of that cereal structure. So roughly, if you look at this on any given year, roughly 15% of the farmed area is has been covered by one of these agri-environment options, although not all are paid by the agri-environment system. Many of the projects and the work that has been done has not been paid through the system by DEFRA. So they've included the conservation headlands, the beetle banks and hedges. Often there is undersown spring barley. They tend to do 40% of that that's planted is undersown, which restricts the amount of herbicides you can use on it. Overwinter stubbles are across the area and provide cover over winter and food resources, and wild bird cover as well. And then, of course, there are feeders for every partridge pair. So they're roughly along a line about 1 every 70 meters to provide food for the pairs in the spring. The other thing that is done is legal predator control directed during the nesting season. So this is not overall year. It is particularly when the hens are sitting on the nests or there's prospecting for nesting going on. And what it does is it maximizes the number of broods that can be produced. So you can do that two ways. You can either increase the nesting habitat, which they've done by putting in beetle banks and hedgerows, and you can also instigate legal predator control, where you control foxids, corvids, and mustelids. And if you look at this, we can calculate what's called a brood production rate for those chicks that are being produced, or those coveys that are being produced. And it's roughly 84% for the managed area, and compared to 60% on the remainder of the study area that's not keepered in such a way. So this is a very particular type of professional keeper directed towards wild gray partridge shoots. It's not a keeper that's releasing pheasants. So some of the effects that we can see in here, we can look at the change in those invertebrate groups. And we've got a significant increase in the non-aphid hemiptera and the caterpillars, the Symphyta and Lepidoptera, compared to the remainder of the area. And I would point out that this part of the study area was never very good, both in insects and in arable flora, but both have significantly increased. And the arable flora has increased amazingly. There are amazing records of in those conservation headlands of things, and I'll show you in a minute, but all of them are significantly higher now than they were beforehand. And that change is only happening on that area that is being managed. So this is a whole suite of arable flora that is increased in number in those conservation headlands. And you get red listed arable flora showing up. So the narrow fruited corn salads, prickly poppies, cornflower, cornfield knotgrass, night flowering catchfly, and my favorite, which is really quite common in some of the conservation inland, is Venus's looking glass. And Dick did surveys of other red listed farmland birds on the area, and all increased with this management. So skylark pairs increased, lapwing pairs, linnets in the winter, yellowhammers, and corn buntings also increased. And it's worthwhile saying that for lapwing, that area of farmed environment on the Sussex Downs holds half of the breeding pairs on farmland in the national park. So there's something like 60 pairs on arable farmland, and 30 were on this area of farmland being managed for gray partridges. And it's not just the farmland birds, it's also raptors and owl numbers, which are higher on the estate than on other farms. When we do our counts in the autumn, we count everything that we see when we go across the Sussex Study area, and actually there's a lot of buzzards, sparrowhawks, peregrines. Very interesting things show up, and the area is known by bird watchers in the south of England as being a place where you can go and see some interesting raptors, especially on the winter when you get passage going through. It's really interesting. So this is the scene about what's happened with gray partridges. This is the spring pairs that are calculated from our autumn counts. You can see the results of this in a couple of papers that we published in 2020. This is updated from that, but generally speaking, there's been some really good years. And in the last few years, not quite as good, but we are still up with the same kind of densities that were the case back in the 70s. So it's a good news story. It is possible to bring back gray partridges. And what we think is important is that these offer some solutions for gray partridges and also for other farmland birds. So we would advocate for in-field habitats, putting in conservation headlands, field banks, those wildflower plots or strips. And from the point of view of restoring gray partridges, strips are very useful if you have gamekeepers. But work in Germany and other places has shown us that plots, which are at least 20 meters wide, are much better for trying to restore gray partridge numbers where you don't have gamekeepers. So there needs to be a bit of adjustment on how you present these habitats based on what else you have going on the farmland. And then the other thing we're very interested in trialing are floristically enhanced grass strips, which some of the areas that we work on for gray partridges have seen to be really useful for producing lots of chick food. And if you manage to recover gray partridge numbers, you should be able to, going along with that is restoring arable flora, increasing chick food insects, and that should help recover other red-listed farmland birds, particularly ones that suffer from low chick production due to the intensification of agriculture. Just to point out that along the way with the Sussex Study, the GWCT and others have used it to try to influence policy and improve agri-environment particularly. So we were involved in reviewing set-aside rules back when that first came in. We reviewed the environmentally sensitive area scheme, which encouraged the government to put in conservation headlands and overwinter stubbles into that scheme. We gave information about a pesticide tax proposal and pointed out that the cheapest pesticides that were being used were also some of the nastiest, and we couldn't manage to tax them enough to make people make a decision to use something that was more benign, because the more benign insecticides were already so much more expensive. So this was a real problem with the whole concept of pesticide tax, and it is still a problem. Development of agri-environmental schemes, we've fed into the countryside stewardship, arable stewardship, the ELS and the HLS, countryside stewardship, and ELMS. We feed in information from Sussex on that. And we particularly helped in the development of the idea of farmer clusters. And the area of the Sussex study is inside the Erin to Ader farmer cluster, and I serve on that steering committee. But Peter Thompson, particularly at the GWCT, was really instrumental in getting that going. And part of it was from work that we'd done on the Sussex study. There are 3 books that have been published about areas either on the whole Sussex study or about areas on the Sussex study. So 2 of those are by Dick Potts. One was done in 1986, and it was where he really set out the whole idea about how pesticides affected gray partridges and what you could do to try to recover numbers. In 2012, he reviewed a lot of the work that had gone on the recovery area with the gray partridge shooting area, but also still interpreted a lot of the arable flora and the insect work that we've been doing. So that's quite useful from that point of view. And in 2024, Roger Morgan Grenfell and the farmer involved, the Duke of Norfolk, published a book this February, which was about the return of the gray partridge, particularly about what they did and how their teams have worked on restoring that area for gray partridges on the Sussex study area or the South Downs. There are many papers and reports that have been published from work on the Sussex study. And the first one I've got on here is from Paul Vickerman and Dick Potts in 1974. And that is a 90-page overview of what they'd found in the first few years by working on the Sussex study. And pretty much everything that we have since published, you can see the beginnings of it in that paper. And you can refer back to that paper and think, well, you know, Dick and Paul had that idea back in 1972, and here we are with the data that still supports it. All the way to the paper that we've just published this year on the changes across 50 years and the changes in the invertebrate numbers. So it's all about partridges. This is what you want to see when you go out to count partridges in the autumn. You've got the male looking the other way, the female looking over her shoulder, and all of the young in between. And this is a good, nice grown covey. And this is what we hope to see when we go out counting in the autumn. And that's it.